Alrighty, so AAC is more than just the idea of giving a kid an iPad. And this is, I think, one of the first thoughts that I've ever had when I went to start doing an AAC presentation is I was sometimes seeing people in the field just hand a kid an iPad and think, bam, AAC, done it, mastered it, piece of cake, I got this. But AAC is so much more than this idea of this educational practice piece. It is an area where people have done a significant amount of research. There are a number of organizations, both within the US as well as internationally. And so AAC is so much more. It's actually an entire like subsection and field of study. So it's important to understand that it really is a very, very large field. And a lot of what AAC has looked at is helping individuals with physical disabilities or things like, say, cerebral palsy, and so really you find that AAC has a large amount of research behind it. AAC is something that we can use to compensate for impairments that are temporary or permanent. So there may be there may be some cases where an individual has a degenerative condition, and something like, say, ALS, and so AAC is going to be useful for that individual because they're not going to recover. It's going to be a strategy or a tool that's going to be for them for life. In other cases, AAC can be provided as a temporary solution. So maybe where, it's, say, an individual with autism where you're using it to kind of jumpstart communication, and then maybe your goal is to fade the AAC system away. Or it can be used, say, if somebody were to have a stroke, they may have a situation where for a period of time they require some form of AAC, but eventually they're able to kind of take that away. And so that's one piece about it. It can be useful for impairments resulting from activity limitations or participation restrictions. And the other thing that's important to understand about AAC is it does affect both production and or comprehension. And so we're going to talk very, very briefly about the comprehension piece, and most of this is going to be focusing on the expression piece. So AAC can be used for receptive language understanding, listener responding. It is a tool to help you to understand the world around you. And so we have these things, we call them visual supports, and they're those aids that help to enhance your understanding, visual schedules, visual stories, visually presented choices. All these things can technically be classified as receptive AAC. So something that I do when I am conducting AAC evaluations or trying to see what kind of supports a person has or will need is I will usually try to take a look at the environment and see how is the environment supporting that person. One thing that I think is a very interesting point, and there's an article here that I would encourage you to take a look at, is there is this statement that individuals with autism are visual learners. I remember when I was first learning about autism way back when, that was one of the first things that I learned about individuals with autism, is that they are visual learners. I've seen books that describe this, and the thing that's kind of interesting is research is not quite as definitive on that as most people may be inclined to think. And I think there's one thing that's really important that a lot of people miss when they talk about the visual versus auditory learner discussion, and that is typically that the persistence of the stimuli in the environment. So for instance, if I am gonna say a word like cookie, right? I say the word cookie and it's gone. The auditory stimulus has disappeared, no longer exists, it's in memory and it's gone. If I'm going to hold up a picture of a cookie, right, that is a stimulus that may persist in the person's environment for a much longer time, maybe for several seconds, maybe for several minutes. It may be something they can view on demand. And so I do think there is a little bit of an unequal comparison sometimes in terms of auditory versus visual stimuli. And it may not be as much that the individuals are actually visual learners as it is that visual stimuli just kind of persist in the environment longer. So that's very helpful for the person. And then think about yourselves. Anytime you go out into the world, we are surrounded by visual stimuli. And so you go to the bathroom and you see a sign that says, male or female, and imagine if you had to listen to the auditory direction of where it is, it would be harder to recall that, and you would make more errors. And so I think, yes, certainly there is that aspect of visual that is beneficial. It may not be as much inherent to autism as some people are inclined to believe. So a couple of things about the rationale for AAC, and then we're going to go into some basic background on it, as well as some assessment pieces. So we know that we can provide amazing intervention to individuals with autism. We can provide world-class ABA. We can provide speech therapy 5 hours a week, 10 hours a week, 100 hours a week. There are some individuals who are not going to develop the ability to effectively communicate using vocal speech alone. And whether that is due to autism itself or whether due to some sort of co-diagnosis, such as, say, apraxia, there are some individuals who do not develop effective vocal speech. And so it is not possible for us to know which students are going to develop that effective vocal speech and which will not. I think we go into every case with a child who is not speaking, and we have the hope that we're going to be able to bring about vocal speech, but we don't have a crystal ball, and we really can't say, I guarantee you this child will develop vocal speech. And if you can, I don't know. I'm not sure on the ethics of that, just because it really isn't possible. And so I've seen estimates that range pretty wildly, but one that I've always kind of quoted is the 25 to 50% of individuals lacking effective vocal speech. And I do think it's important to clarify that's not saying that they're completely non-vocal. That's just individuals for whom vocal speech alone is insufficient. 1 second, just getting an email through about this. All right. 4. Okay. Any of you guys from Uncommon Thread, can you send a message to Jennifer Larkin with the information? That'd be very helpful. She said she didn't get the email. Alrighty. Yeah, I mentioned about the estimates. And what we know is if we don't have effective, yes. If we don't have effective vocal speech, then a person is going to be less able to communicate their wants and needs. They're going to be less able to participate in social interactions, and they're going to start to use challenging behaviors. And that's really the biggest concern. And anytime I'm trying to make the case for why AAC is important, what I will usually try to do is establish that the person's current communication is probably not effective, and then highlight the fact that, well, if you can't get something across the right way, how else are you going to do it? And so most individuals learn to communicate using challenging behavior if appropriate behaviors are not getting them what they want or need. Sometimes people will call it maladaptive behavior. In fact, for that person, it actually is very adaptive. It's just not very desirable. And so that certainly is something very important from the perspective of rationales for why AAC is important. We know that AAC has been highlighted as a means to facilitate both speech production as well as the development of language skills. Another important thing to highlight, and I do this not to be kind of controversial or anything like that, but just because I do think it's important to clarify this as well. Research in the field of speech language pathology in particular does not support that AAC negatively affects spoken language development. And this is something that I've heard people talk about quite a bit. Yes, research basically, what research basically shows is that AAC can support the development of vocal speech. So things like PECs, things like sign language, there are research studies that will show that some individuals will develop vocal speech as a result of that. However, I do caution people against taking that statement and flipping it into the reverse, which is to say that AAC never inhibits vocal speech. That is a very, very strong statement that ultimately is it's not true. There are individuals, I've worked with them, who have had reduced vocal speech because of AAC. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because if one modality is less effortful, there may be a small percentage of individuals who simply decide that I'm going to use this modality that's less effortful. And so, unfortunately, what I have seen sometimes is people take the research that shows that you can increase vocal speech, and they flipped it to say it never inhibits. And the reason most people do that is because they're trying to operate under the premise that it is better to give someone the support than to withhold the support. And I do agree with that fact, that it is important to provide people with the opportunity to communicate. But it's also something where people have to be honest about the potential for some individuals. And I'll try to talk about that later, but that is something that I do talk about very honestly, is that although the research does not support that vocal speech will decrease, people are people. And I'm going to probably say this a couple times, but we have research to show that PECS works. We have research to show that sign works. We have some research to show that speech generating devices work, but you're never going to find a study that's going to definitively say this mode or this mode, because people are people and studies are studies. And so studies tell us what works. They are proof of concept, but proof of concept does not tell you definitively that this is always going to work. If it did, then you would know that this particular prompting strategy always works for this person, or you could fill out a little checklist and say 100% guaranteed I'll be able to teach this person using this particular strategy. Life is not like that, and AAC is particularly the case where you really can't assume something is going to happen. So that's kind of my thoughts on that one. And a couple other things to highlight from a research perspective. So the landmark study, Carl Christie, is one that really demonstrated that PECS was effective in 3 domains in terms of vocal communication, social communication, and reducing challenging behavior. It's really the study that would be out there that really highlights what PECS is capable of doing. And again, so important to say that what PECS is capable of doing. It does not say that every kid who's on PECS is going to be doing all of these things. It says that PECS can do this. A couple other things in terms of some of the reviews that were published. So UNC has a review which explicitly lists PECS as evidence-based practice for individuals with autism. So that's a nice one to show that you have the evidence behind it. And then the National Autism Center, they list PECS and AAC devices as emerging evidence. And I do have a bit of a issue with this. The first is really just on the point of technicality, which is that PECS is considered actually an AAC device. It's considered no tech, but what they really probably meant to say was SGDs, but that sort of terminology snafu, if you will, kind of makes me feel a little bit down on the report, because I just feel like it's important to kind of make that distinction very clear. And the reality is, I think that if those two things were combined, there certainly is more than enough evidence to show that AAC in a picture-based form has evidence, regardless of whether or not there is speech output or simply a picture exchange. So I don't know that it's completely necessary to be splitting hairs like this in terms of all the different modalities of AAC, but it is there. And so we do have evidence to show that it is at least evidence-based, or at least emerging. To be honest, I don't really know anyone in the field who would consider PECS emerging. I think most people would admit that it's pretty solidly researched. And SGDs, this is one where I think the research just has to catch up with clinical practice, because I mean, I can speak for myself alone, the number of students who I brought through devices in terms of learning to request and to be able to label and answer questions. And I know I'm clearly not the only one. All right, last one is some research supporting SGDs. So there is research supporting the effectiveness of SGDs, but it is pretty minimal in terms of the evidence for improvement in vocal speech. I'm sure research is continuing to come in, but certainly still less at this point. And it is interesting because one of people's main theories or thoughts about speech generating devices is that that because they provide a vocal model, that of course they're going to help the person to develop their vocal speech. And again, the reality is that that is an assumption, and there may be individuals for whom that happens, but every person is different. So just because there is a voice output does not mean that you're going to see increases in vocal speech. But Sigafus as well as Laura both had studies where they basically evaluated the ability to use iPads to do things like request. The kinds of studies that are out there that I've seen are generally pretty basic in terms of the skills that get taught with devices. And again, from a clinical perspective, have certainly exceeded these types of things far, far away. Okay, so a little bit about communication modalities. And I highlight these two things just because this is kind of the convention in AAC. I don't think it's particularly that relevant, but I will mention it anyway. So there are two different ways of classifying AAC modes. One is aided, the other is unaided. Aided is do you need additional supports and materials? So things like SGDs, simple voice output devices, PECs, picture boards, or unaided, do you not require any additional equipment? So those are things like speech, facial expression, and sign language. And one thing I want to highlight with sign language is there are actually two forms that are typically used. One is ASL and one is signed exact English. If you don't know that there's a difference between these two things, then it is important that you have that understanding, because sign language actually gets pretty complex. And the main thing I want to highlight is ASL is actually its own language, and it has its own sentence order. So if you wanted to say something like, what is your name in ASL, you would actually say your name what. So you would reverse the sentence order and you would put the question at the end. You would also do things like raise your eyebrows, which I'm terrible at doing. But the point is that you actually have a different sentence order. Versus if you were doing that in signed exact English, you would go, what is your name? And so you would follow the typical structure of English language. And the reason I mention this is because there are many people who teach students with autism and they don't necessarily consider which thing they're even teaching. They just teach a bunch of nouns, maybe some verbs, but ultimately, it's important to understand with things like ASL and signed exact English that they are two different things. And where it really can have impact is things like morphemes and endings of words. So in ASL, you might not have to indicate them as much, versus signed exact English, you would typically indicate some sort of a word ending. So I put this here just because I want to show a little bit of what's out there. But this is not going to be a talk where I go through and review every single app that exists, because quite frankly, I think the app selection is much less relevant than most people realize than most people realize it is. App selection is important because there are features, but quite frankly, I can program most apps to give a kid what they need. There are a couple of exceptions. So for instance, there is LAMP, there is the LAMP Words for Life and Speak for Yourself are ones that are set up very particularly, but other ones like Proloco to Go, Go Talk Now, Touch Chat, there are some features that make some better than others. And if you want at the end, I can give you some feedback on some of that stuff. But by and large, apps are more about how you program them and what your language programming looks like. You can have the best app or the worst app, but if your language programming is terrible, it's not going to matter. So I think sometimes people really do stress out a lot about the actual app selection, and unfortunately, I think that kind of causes people undue stress. Here's what I will say. So. One of the things I meant to mention beforehand is I talked a little bit about my experience from a clinical practice perspective. I didn't talk about my coursework experience. I also had the chance to take some assistive technology courses from East Carolina University and learned a lot of good stuff on assistive technology fundamentals there. And one of the things about assistive technology is that all things being equal, the most cost-effective solution is the one that should be pursued. So for that reason, if a kid or a student does not require the full comprehensive features of Proloco to Go and a simpler app would fit the bill, you should, from an assistive technology perspective, be selecting a more cost-effective app. That being said, you can also consider things like ease of training, ease of use, where the student might go in the future. But that is something that is important to understand is, you shouldn't just get, you shouldn't just be getting everyone Proloco to Go because that's the app of the day. I've heard of places where like they only give kids LAMP or they only give kids Proloco to Go, and that sort of one size fits all is just not a good idea in my mind. And I really don't feel it's in line with the tenets of ABA. ABA is designed to be individualized intervention. So how can you possibly individualize if everybody gets the same, or if everyone's board looks the exact same? So anyway, these are some apps that are out there. Most of these, this list I will admit is several years old, and it was based on iOS. I have not done as much research in the Android world, even though I do now own an Android phone, which anyone who knows that I was an Apple diehard still can't get over that one. All right, so selecting a response modality. This is another one that's a little controversial, and I do find that people tend to fall into camps on this one. The reality is that there is no clear answer that's emerged as to which forms are most ideal, nor I don't think will there ever be, because it's just going to depend on what works for that person. And what we do find, though, is that the form of AAC is often the result of a person's academic training, clinical experience, past successes, personal bias, or organizational bias. I once had worked with an organization where they literally made the statement that we don't give PECs to kids, or an organization that said we don't do any form of AAC. And so in cases like that, there is a kind of a predetermination about what is going to happen. I've also seen it done where the organization says, well, I teach everybody to sign, including like kids who are completely vocal. I don't really understand that one either. So we do see certainly that there are a lot of reasons why people introduce one particular form of AAC over another. In general, and this is an incredible generality, but when you think about it, it's kind of logical. If a person is more adept at matching and receptive identification, that's going to suggest better success with picture-based systems. I don't think that's a huge leap. As well as a person who has better performance with fine motor skills, as well as imitation, would suggest increased success with sign language. And in terms of the motor ability for sign language piece, the person doesn't have to have the world's most precise signs, but what's going to happen is if their ability to sign is not precise and their signs are very sloppy, over time it's going to become difficult for them to produce signs that are distinguishable from one another. And then what's going to happen is it's going to really start to impact their ability to communicate a message effectively. In addition, what we find is that individuals, if they have very modified signs, that starts to, again, reduce the number of people who actually understand the signs. So that's one of the reasons why motor skills do tend to be important if you are looking at sign language. What we find, though, is that there are some people who advocate strongly for one specific mode or another. I have observed some individuals in particular contending that sign language is superior and should always be the first approach. And one of the reasons why that approach might get stated is because there's research that shows that sign language can increase vocal responding. I would simply say that there's also research that shows that PECs can increase vocal responding. So I see your research and here's mine. So call. The other thing about that is some people say that because sign language has more similarity to speech, so in the fact that signs are distinct in the same manner that phonemes are distinct, that it is superior. And this is what's known as the topography-based argument. So as opposed to the idea that you use the same method of indicating response when you are using something like an iPad, so you're using a single pointed finger and pressing different icons. People point out that this is really a theoretical issue and that there is still a significant amount of research on picture-based systems, and that the ultimate goal is to teach language. And so I think that this is sometimes something where people get a little bit hung up on and tend to kind of stand their ground on certain kinds of theoretical issues. And ultimately it's what is effective for this person's language development. And if it's picture-based, it's picture-based. I also tend to see that people will get a little stressed out over verbal operants. So if you've ever talked to somebody who says that, well, it can't be attacked because they are matching a picture to a picture. And so they have a non-identical matching task, and they're looking at a cookie, but they're selecting a picture of a cookie on the device, but it's not technically tacting. What I would say is to go to the function and the way that it is used in the environment. And so if the person is using it to essentially comment and observe in their environment, although it may not meet the technical definition from a verbal behavior perspective, it certainly seems to meet the functional definition in terms of what they're accomplishing. A person who has to navigate through 10 screens to select a particular icon, although it is very, very delayed matching, I would argue it's still pretty effective in terms of what they're accomplishing. I know people may be inclined on something like a VB map or ables or peak to indicate like an asterisk if they feel like they want to clarify that technically it's not a pure tact. And so that certainly is something that people can do if they are so inclined. I think one of the important things to really talk about with augmentative communication is what is the purpose of this form of communication. And if your goal is to repair unintelligible speech to people outside of their typical circle, the reality is sign language really doesn't do much to help repair communication unless it's someone in that circle who happens to know sign language. But a person in that circle would probably also recognize something like a vocal approximation. So people with autism, their natural community is not the deaf community. So they're not expanding who they can talk to necessarily because they've learned sign language. They also tend to produce idiosyncratic signs. So even if someone knows sign language, they may not know their sign. And when you think about the experience of going out into the community, not many people are going to know sign language, and so you're not really helping to expand who they can communicate with if sign language is the modality that you are choosing. The reality is picture-based systems are infinitely more intelligible to unfamiliar partners, and especially if there is some sort of a voice output. Granted that in the community in particular, devices are rarely loud enough to actually be heard by other people, but you can teach compensatory strategies like turning the device toward the person you're speaking to. And so ultimately what we know is that there is no universally accepted answer to what's right, should be individualized and tailored to the strength of the learner. A multimodal approach is something that I would advocate, and I do so in a way that is important to make a distinction here, that the multimodal approach is not the spaghetti approach of you try anything, you see what sticks. That is not what I'm recommending. What I'm recommending and saying is you need to look at the person's environment and recognize that we all will communicate in different ways at different times. So anyone who has been out to a restaurant, or in particular a restaurant where maybe you don't know the language, I'm sure you've all had the experience of pointing to something on a menu, right? And you're not using your vocal speech to communicate, but you're using a gesture and you're indicating what it is that you want. You're using an additional form of communication, or maybe you talk with your hands to try to supplement with what you're saying. The point is that you're using multiple forms of communication. And so there may be times when a person requires AAC strategies, and maybe they're different from what their typical AAC system is. So for instance, a person may primarily use sign language as a form of communication, but when they go out into the community, maybe what they do is they exchange a picture-based ordering card because that's something that makes sense for them in that environment. So what I would encourage people to do is to really think about how is this person going to communicate most effectively in this particular environment, and sometimes you may have to have different sorts of strategies that you do combine. Now, you may have one particular AAC system that's their primary form of communication, say an iPad with Proloco to Go, but that doesn't mean that you can't supplement with other forms, say low-tech forms in certain scenarios. Research does suggest the idea of learner preference being a deciding factor. And so there's been several studies that have looked at this. People have commented that the studies are not the most well done. I think that, again, it's a little tricky when you're comparing picture-based to non-picture-based, because with picture-based system, you have that visual reminder that's kind of in front of you at all times. So it is a little bit of an unfair comparison. But generally speaking, when they do look at things like learner preference, however they assess it, they do tend to see that picture-based systems tend to be preferred by individuals. So there you go. All right, the other thing that is I would be remiss if I did not say is the importance of having an SLP involved in the decision-making process. And this is something that I could probably spend a lot of time talking about, but the reality is that SLPs do go through specialized training. Many of them have training in grad school, as well as it is in their scope of practice. It is an area of competency. And so because SLPs have the experience and the expertise in speech and language skills, it is often very, very important that they are involved in the process in some capacity. And this is obviously a far bigger discussion in terms of speech and language, scope of practice and all that stuff. What I will say is that I do choose my words very carefully. I do say that SLPs have the expertise, and I do say that BCBAs also have expertise. I kind of refrain from giving any one person the sole title of expert. I think that everyone has their own areas of strength and knowledge that they bring to the table, and the two fields kind of can work together. But certainly this is an area where I think SLPs definitely have that good knowledge base. However, there is a challenge because not all SLPs have equal training in AAC. So I was part of the United States Autism, the United States Society for AAC, and one of the things that I was doing was I was looking around different programs to get a sense of what college programs offer or require AAC courses, and it's not required by all schools from what I had seen. So the reality is that not all SLPs are going to have that same amount of training. In addition, and this is a really important distinction in my mind, there is a difference between AAC and AAC for autism. I do firmly believe that there are things about AAC in general that cannot be generalized to autism. Autism has its own specific needs and requirements in the field of AAC. And sometimes where I see SLPs struggle is if they're not really well versed in autism, they may make general AAC recommendations, which might be fine for someone with, say, cerebral palsy or some other sort of impairment, but is not necessarily the most appropriate recommendation for a person with autism. So some frustrations that I've seen BCBAs encounter are SLPs who don't necessarily have the expertise in terms of AAC with autism, and then that can be honestly a very challenging situation, and that's one where collaboration just has to try to happen to the maximum extent possible. I don't have a ton of great answers on that one. But I think it's important that SLPs continue to receive that training because they need to be kind of the leaders in this regard. Which I think brings us to the assessment piece. So in terms of the assessment of needs, assessment is an important step that should guide intervention. So, and maybe me saying that is very obvious, and I apologize for that, but there are some people who would just jump to intervention without any form of assessment. And, it's the same with any sort of language intervention or any sort of intervention. If you just jumped into doing things, yeah, you might be able to do an okay job, but really I think you need to know where the person's at. And so that's really the purpose of yes, Emily, it is. I think I'll talk about motor planning later. I hope so. If I don't, just remind me again, because I do have some thoughts on that one. All right, so yeah, so anyway, obviously assessment is certainly important. Again, this kind of gets back in the same question I brought up earlier, is to what extent is an AAC evaluation in the scope of practice of a BCBA? And I would say it's really not. Yes, you can look at the behaviors and you can assess the behaviors, but an actual AAC evaluation is really something that is something that should be done by an SLP or an assistive technology professional. And so for that reason, I do kind of recommend that you're always working with an SLP to conduct evaluations. And then the question becomes, well, what if there's no SLP available, and what are the ethical issues? Certainly I think what I've seen is if an SLP is not available, most people tend to start with PECs because you can attend the PECs training and they train both BCBAs and SLPs. But then, the issue is, well, what about when they need a high-tech system? How do we kind of assess for that? That's where I do recommend referring out to someone who has the expertise, just because they're going to be best equipped. Yes, you could give a child Proloco to go probably, and you're not going to hurt them, but I think that there are better ways to go through the process than just taking a guess and seeing what happens. In terms of some stuff on AAC assessment philosophy, I put this in here, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Basically, there were kind of two different schools of thought. The first one is more of a candidacy model, which simply says you have to meet these criteria in order to qualify for AAC. And then there's the participation model, which says, well, what does the person need? What are the barriers to communication, and how can we provide them with effective communication skills? And so those are really your two approaches to AAC assessment. The candidacy model is considered outdated, antiquated. People do not like it. And so people now mostly use the participation model. So in terms of AAC evaluation team members, the kind of people who would be involved, I already mentioned SLPs and AAC or AT specialists. They're the people who would, based on their credentialing and scope of practice and training, be most qualified to lead an AAC evaluation. But granted, there are other people involved in the process, such as classroom teachers, instructional paraprofessionals, OTs, PTs, BCBAs, parents, and of course, the student. In terms of components of what's involved in an AAC evaluation or what should be involved in AAC evaluation, the first one is always record review. Record review is doing things like looking at a child's past evaluations, looking at present levels, really looking at their current performance in terms of communication, because you want to see what are they able to do, what are they not able to do, because that gives you a sense of areas for growth and tells you to what extent they're able to communicate these things. Next would be some form of a questionnaire, which really is designed to get information from both school and parents in terms of where do they feel the child's communication lies, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, and ultimately what are they looking for the AAC intervention to actually do for that child. And this is a nice place because you can really try to identify some sort of biases that exist, as well as you can kind of get some red flags in terms of maybe some unrealistic expectations for the AAC evaluation. So for instance, when you do this sort of questionnaire, you may find parents who say, I'm doing this because I want them to have the system in for 1 year and then they're gonna learn to talk and then they're not gonna need it anymore. And I'm sure it probably goes without saying, but that's not how this works. You can't make that sort of a promise that you're gonna do this and it's gonna come out. You don't know that. It's gonna be in as long as it needs to be in. And then there is observation. Observation, I think, is also a very important piece, particularly in the home, because many times school and home have very different needs. My experience has been that many school programs are very teacher-directed and many homes are very child-directed. And when you have those two different environments, they're going to lend to very different styles of communication. So you may see a child who looks perfectly fine in school, but at home their communication really, really suffers, or vice versa. And so you really need to kind of look at those different environments. The next is direct skills assessment. I'm going to take you through that on the next slide or next couple slides. And then a report, meeting, and then a trial. In most cases, if I am anything less than 100% certain, I will recommend that we do a trial of a particular system, maybe for 3, 4, 5 weeks. But that's something that we will do just to make sure that the person that we're selecting, that the correct system for that individual. So very, very rarely will I just recommend something outright. I pretty much always recommend some sort of a trial, unless it's just completely inappropriate. All right, so the next couple slides, I'm hoping you can see them okay. If not, I can send these to you if you send me an email. These are also on Teachers Pay Teachers, just plugging myself. Yeah, so these are an AAC assessment data collection form that I made long enough ago that you can see my credentials at the bottom are still MA, and this is 2014 actually. So this just kind of takes you through some of the main pieces that are actually assessed in an AAC evaluation. So the first one is access skills. And so this one, what we're looking at is what sort of finger, what sort of finger the person is using and what hand. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I will go through an entire evaluation and have no idea what hand they used or no idea what finger they used. I pay attention to the most minor details, and yet I will also miss the most obvious things in the world. So I actually have that there. So I will just remind myself to not write, to write that down. You also want to look at things like, do they cross midline to access targets? How quickly are they responding when they're using the device? Are they consistently attending, whatever attending means? Also looking at things like scanning, can they select an icon at different sorts of sizes? I will just say in general that access is less of an issue than I think it used to be. So back before the iPad, if we can imagine such a time, and back before the iPhone, there were devices out there, Dynavox devices, if anybody remembers them, that were touchscreen based devices. And for some kids, this was like their first experience with a touchscreen device. So they were like, what is this thing? And it was very difficult for them to learn to use these systems. Now you have kids who are 12 months of age and who are navigating a phone better than some adults, quite frankly. So I think access is genuinely less of an issue than it used to be, just because we are training people like from birth to use touchscreen devices. But nevertheless, I do still assess it just to get a sense of what a person can do. but it is true that people can mostly do things like, you use an iPhone. I mean, there are kids who can navigate the smallest of icons, so access not as big of an issue. Obviously, you also want to make sure that things like vision and hearing are intact and within normal limits. The bigger one is symbol understanding. So with symbol understanding, you're really trying to get a sense of, do they seem to perform better with things like actual photographs versus line drawing symbols versus text. And to some degree, there are some kids or people for whom it doesn't matter that much, but there are some individuals for whom this really does matter. And I'll talk more about symbol understanding a little bit later. There's a couple different ways that a person can assess symbol understanding. You can use an assessment called the TASP, the test of aided communication symbol performance by Joan Bruno. Also, there's an app called AAC Genie. It's a decent app, and that can also be useful for assessing symbol understanding. What I will do as well, if I don't use either of those, is I might just do kind of a matching assessment and get a sense of how the person is able to match. What sort of arrays can they match within? Can they match identical versus non-identical? And does the background make a difference? I remember I had a student where I went through a matching assessment, and I did find that the backgrounds, if they did not match in color, that was actually more important than the foreground for that student. So that told me a lot of very useful information. But matching assessments can be adapted in a variety of ways. Symbol assessments can be adapted. Other things I'm going to look for, audio imitation. So there are two different types of speech that devices will output. So they will output either digitized or synthesized. So digitized is that recorded human speech, and synthesized is the more robotic sounding speech, which is getting more and more human-like every day. As anybody who has an Alexa or Google or anything like that knows. And I apologize if I woke up your Alexa by saying that. And a second time. But those are different things that we can look at from an audio imitation perspective. And so what I do sometimes is I will actually see to what extent does the individual imitate recorded speech. If they don't imitate recorded speech readily, sometimes I will put this in as an instructional program, either concurrently with a trial or once they get a device. But I do want to see if the person can imitate recorded speech, just to get a sense of how they would do with that. Then I'll look at a usage assessment. So this is really just a requesting session. So what I do is I run man training, and I try to see how quickly I'm able to get them from a single icon to sentence level. And I've had students where I can get them from a single icon to a sentence within a half hour, and there are some kids who it definitely is going to take a lot of work. And so I really just want to do a requesting session and see kind of how far I can take them. I will try to do what's called the prompt-free approach. So the prompt-free approach is essentially take the screen, have a single icon in front of them, put the screen between you and the child and an item, and kind of just let them press the icon on the screen and see what happens, and basically give that meaning and build that cause and effect relationship. Because for some kids, once you start prompting, they are very difficult to then get that independent responding. So the prompt-free approach can be a good approach if you are trying to get some requesting going. There's other things on here that I do assess, and I'm not going to go through all of it. I will look at the child's responsiveness to language modeling. So we'll talk about language modeling later, but because it is a strategy that's often recommended for people who use AAC, it is important to get a sense of how well the person responds to using language models. Also, and I realize that this is ridiculous for me saying this right now, but if you are in a group of if there's more than one person who is attending on one username, please send me a message so that I'm aware of everyone who is on there, because I'm going to be using the usernames to essentially know who is attending this webinar. Also, because this happens to make me remember this, the first secret word is cat. The first secret code word is cat. This is the word you will need when you're filling out the survey at the end of the course to show that you are attending. So there you go. Okay. All right, the other thing I'm going to assess with an AAC evaluation is literacy skills. Literacy skills are incredibly important from an AAC perspective because if we can develop literacy, that really takes a child to the next level from a communication perspective. So we're looking at things like, can they blend sounds, identify letters, letter sounds, sight words, CVC words, can they spell words? Because if we want a child to be able to do things like type and spell and things like that, well, then they need to have literacy skills. A child who has not developed literacy skills is not going to start typing in sentences. That's facilitated communication. That's ridiculous, and it's not a thing. So we definitely want to make sure that kids have intact literacy ability, and if they don't, that's something that we can work toward teaching them. Yeah, so two other things I'll just highlight. Every once in a while, I will put a little measure of speech intelligibility on here. This is adapted from the MUSS scale. And then the last thing I will mention is, let me see something here. Yes, I will absolutely do that. I will email that. Just send me an email if you can. And I will email out the AAC data collection forms. Or maybe I'll just put a thing on the survey. Okay, so last one I'll mention is sign language. So with sign language, I will often assess this during an AAC evaluation. And as you may have guessed, most of this presentation is geared toward picture-based communication. But I do think there is something to mention regarding the sign language piece. So when I am assessing for sign language, I usually assess 3 different pieces. I look to see, can the person match the location of the sign? So a sign that's say up here versus here, can they match the hand shape? So if I do an A versus B versus C versus D, E, F, G, whatever, can they match that actual hand shape? And then the last thing is I'll look at things like movement. So can they do something like, clap 2 times versus clap 1 time, or slow versus fast? I want to look at what is the precision of their motor movement. And sometimes if sign is a good option for a child, I may supplement the educational programming with a precision of fine motor movements program where I really try to do things like target the precision of what we're doing. And that's something like, if you've ever told a child to raise, one hand and they raise both hands, like, good job. Like, no, you told them to raise one hand. Or if you say do this and they raise one hand, not doing this. You want to be precise. Or if you raise slowly, they should raise slowly. So certainly I do try to encourage precision if something like sign language is going to be an option. All right, so a little more about symbol stuff. So symbol types can be a factor. At the same time, it's not that people need to necessarily progress this entire hierarchy, just understanding that there is a hierarchy in terms of what's generally considered most representative to least representative. But people can skip within this hierarchy, and just because they understand, product logos doesn't mean that they are going to automatically understand photographs. There's a special type of symbol that I do want to talk about. It's called TOBI symbols, true object-based icons. And they're basically 2D cutouts of 3D symbols. What they do is they take out the background so that they more closely resemble the items being represented. They are very, very time consuming to make, as you can imagine by that picture. But for learners who really have a difficult time with picture-based symbols, they can be a good option. I do kind of always give a shout out to Sarah Smith, who was the one who created, who kind of showed me about true object-based icons, and that those are some of her icons from her own company. And so the TOBI symbols can be a good option, but if you don't have to go down that road, you definitely should not. Ideally, you're going to assess symbol understanding prior to using visual supports or implementing high-tech AAC. As I mentioned, TASP or matching and receptive ID formats can be good options. Okay, so we're going to start to move into the intervention pieces, and kind of a couple thoughts before we actually get there that are going to lead us into it. Assessment should guide intervention. Intervention should begin with a highly motivating context, should consider functions of communication. There's nothing really groundbreaking there. Certainly with intervention, In almost all cases that I have ever done it, it almost always starts out with man training, because you want to get that buy-in for that person. I would say you're a very brave soul if you're going to start out an AAC intervention with something like social questions. Also, what's going to happen is you might not get a lot of buy-in from that person. They're going to be like, I'm not using this thing. It's work. I don't want to do this. So really looking at man context is a recommended one in terms of starting AAC systems. So there's two things to kind of tackle here before we get into the intervention. One is the idea of prerequisite skills. And so, people will kind of make very general statements of there's never this or there's always this. Generally speaking in life, I run from anybody who says never or always, because I just don't believe that those are true for most individuals. And so the National Joint Committee for Communication Needs of Persons with Severe Disabilities says there are no prerequisites to the beginning use of AAC. And so the reality is that if we're looking at foundational skills, say PECS phase 1 and 2, then certainly we can say that, yeah, you don't have to have a ton of established skills. You don't even have to have matching. You just have to be able to reach and pick up and release, which most individuals with autism have those skills. At the same time, if what your goal is more is for authentic and independent communication, then what we're going to look at is that matching is a really, really important skill. Sometimes what happens in the field of AAC is there's kind of a divide in terms of, is my goal that they're just participating in the activity, or is my goal that they are independently doing something and that they understand what they're doing? And this is a divide where I also see sometimes AAC for autism and AAC in general. And so an example might be a child who has severe cognitive deficits, and the best that they can do is to hit a single button that says the entire Pledge of Allegiance. And they do it when the teacher gives them a gesture, and by doing that, they are involved in the class environment. For that person, that's a participation-based goal. That's great for them. But for our individuals with autism, we are typically going for more independent and authentic type performance. So yeah, I could teach a kid with autism to hit the entire Pledge of Allegiance on the device. And that's fine. And that might get them involved in say, circle time. But I'm also not under the illusion that they know the Pledge of Allegiance. And when I'm thinking about the way that I've advanced their language, what I've essentially done is give them one really, really, really long rote phrase. And that hasn't necessarily advanced their ability to communicate independently, but at the same time, they are more involved in an activity. So I think you have to really think about what is your goal for that person in terms of how they are communicating in the environment. So in general, when we're looking at things like prerequisite skills in general, if you're looking at a picture-based system, matching far and away is one of the most important skills that you can work on for that person, because they're usually doing some form of non-identical matching when they're using a picture-based system. There are some other important skills to consider. And the first one, and I don't even know that I should have it on here anymore, is just attending. And attending is this amorphous term that really, what does attending even mean? But they should be able to have some sort of visual attention. So maybe where they can visually sustain their eyes on some sort of a stimulus. Maybe that's better defined. Joint attention and generalized imitation, particularly if you're using a modeling approach, because if your premise is that they're imitating what you're doing, well, then they should have imitation, as well as motivation. I like to believe I can teach most kids with autism to communicate using AAC, but if a kid has no motivation, that's a really, really challenging task. When I think about the students who I have struggled to teach augmentative communication to, it's usually students who don't have motivation for anything. Maybe all they're interested in is stereotypy, and we can't put that under any sort of stimulus control. And so in the absence of motivation, it can be very, very difficult. So that's certainly an important piece. An approximation of an isolated point, steady hand. You do need some form of motor control if you're going to be looking at using your finger to select things. Obviously adequate vision. Categorization, maybe, but you can usually teach categorization through the system. And ultimately, it's not always crucial if they know that that's the food folder, as long as they can navigate to it effectively and efficiently. And then understanding of cause and effect, which really should not be last on here, should be much higher up in this list. But they need to understand that I do this and this happens, which usually can be taught through man training. Okay. Presuming competence. This is an entire quote that was by the CEO of Avaz back in 2014. This is something he sent via email. And there's nothing in here that I think is the worst thing in the world. I just want to clarify this, and this is nothing against him personally or against Avaz as an app, but this is the statement here. Presuming competence means that even though we do not get a window into a nonverbal child's mind as easily as we do with verbal children, we must nonetheless assume that they are as intelligent, as capable, and as competent as a typically developing child. And where the challenge lies in this is the last one in terms of the competency and even, I think we have to recognize that we want children to achieve amazing things, but to presume that all of this is basically in there, and this kind of leads you to the thought process that things need to be unlocked, that all the ability is there, and if you just give them the right tool, it's like magically going to come out. And we know that that's not true. And the challenge is that things like presuming competence, they do lead to the ideas of things like facilitated communication and rapid prompting method. And it's not to say that just because you say presumed competence means that automatically you believe in facilitated communication and rapid prompting method. It's not quite true. But the same mentality of presuming competence is the same one that gets endorsed by facilitated communication and rapid prompting method. The problem with presuming competence is it does promote participation over authenticity and independence. It promotes hopes and beliefs over evidence and reality. It relies on an emotional appeal as opposed to a rational one. And so all of these things basically say that, listen, it's all in there. We just have to get it out. And that is just a bit of magical thinking. And it does not recognize that AAC intervention is language intervention, and language intervention is hard work. ABA is hard work. It's one of the reasons why sometimes we do struggle from a PR and marketing perspective, is because we don't pretend that ABA is going to be magical and that kids are going to get, and that they're going to be cured, and that they're going to be using full sentences within a week. We don't try to say that's going to happen. And so what happens is people will see these things out there that look amazing, and they want to go for the magical approach. But we know that ABA is not magical. We know that it's hard work. It's language intervention, and that's what AAC is. It's language intervention. 99.9% of kids, if you give them a keyboard, their ability to use that keyboard is going to be in line with what their literacy abilities are. And so if they don't have literacy abilities, they're not going to be using the keyboard to communicate in sentences. And so unfortunately, you kind of see that this sort of mind thought does kind of exist. Yes. And so my recommendation is to replace the term of presuming competence with the idea of presuming potential, because I think that is really what people are trying to get at, is that you want to believe that kids can achieve great things, but at the same time you do need to objectively measure things, and that's where sometimes the facilitated communication breaks down, as they say, oh well, you can't really objectively measure it because it involves this other person. Ultimately we want to look at what the person can demonstrate, and of course the argument people make is, well, they shouldn't have to prove themselves, but they do. To some degree. Travers and Ayers have a nice critique and a detailed discussion about presuming competence. And so, yeah, I would recommend people look at that. All right, I'm going to take a 1-minute break, and then I'm going to start into the next section. So 1 minute.